Welcome to Crossroads. Bangladesh is currently undergoing a change in power. Look, after 15 years in office, the country's prime minister resigned and then fled the country. Its parliament was dissolved, and now there are allegations in India that the power change is being orchestrated by the Chinese Communist Party. Local media report that Indian intelligence officials allege that the CCP and Pakistan are behind the student movement currently protesting on the streets, and that the goal is to install a new regime in Bangladesh that is friendly to China and that opposes India. Briefly, this is what's now taking place in Bangladesh, right? So dubbed a Gen Z revolution inside the country, Bangladesh has been going through weeks of protests, primarily by students, against Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, who has since resigned and then fled the country. Hasina, who's 76, has been in power for 15 years. And according to critics and rights groups, allegedly, had increasingly stifled civil freedoms, becoming more authoritarian. And according to local media, the student protests originally began as being against civil service job quotas, but spiraled into nationwide protests against Hasina after the government crackdown on the protests turned deadly. Hasina resigned and fled the country as a result. And on Tuesday, it was announced that Nobel Peace Prize laureate Muhammad Yunus will be the chief advisor of Bangladesh's interim government, something the leaders of the student protesters had said that they wanted. Now, it's important to note, the group that could potentially take over the interim government, that student group, Nahid Islam, is the one that Indian intelligence is now warning about. Now look, here's what's now being said in India about the allegations of Pakistan and the Chinese Communist Party being behind this. Times of India said this: intelligence establishment sees the hand of Pakistan's external intelligence agency, ISI, and its Chinese patron in escalating the protests and subversion that forced Sheikh Hasina to flee the country. Information reaching here in India point to the not-so-subtle hand of Islami Chhatra Shibir, ICS, the student wing of hardline Jamaat-e-Islami Bangladeshi, which is known for its anti-India stance in inflaming the streets and turning protests over quotas into a determined effort to replace Hasina with a regime that is friendly to Pakistan and China and hospitable for the anti-India terror groups which would work out of Bangladesh before the crackdown ordered by the ousted Awami League government. It says the intelligence inputs alluded to meticulous planning undertaken by ICS, again Pakistan, members several months prior, aimed at instigating widespread violence across the nation. And they said this, quote, the ISI-backed Jamaat-e-Islami had received substantial financial backing earlier this year to destabilize the Sheikh Hasina government. A significant portion of its funding is believed to have originated from Chinese entities operating in Pakistan, according to one of these unnamed officials. Now again, that's an allegation in India. I cannot confirm that, right? We just going by what they're saying. But this is actually kind of part of a trend we're watching. And interestingly, more reports like this came out in India. And the allegation was that not only, again, is the CCP behind it, but that it also ties into an agenda to install a government similar to the Taliban in Afghanistan, which we also saw, of course, the CCP meeting with Taliban leaders shortly before they took over the country. Now, the Economic Times said this: the ICS, known for its anti-India stance and jihadist agenda, has been under Indian intelligence surveillance for some time due to its activities in regions adjacent to Bangladesh and affiliation with the ISI-backed Harkat-ul-Jihad al-Islam, HUJI. It notes that evidence shows ICS members undergoing training in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And notably, this is important. To understand this, you have to understand the way that the maps were drawn and how tribal regions were divided. For example, a lot of people pointed out that the Taliban and previously Al-Qaeda, a lot of them represented more tribal regions, the Taliban in particular. The Taliban was mostly Pashtun. They were Pashtun tribes. And of course, the Northern Alliance was a lot of the opposition tribes against the Pashtun. A lot of the battles we see are actually tribal systems. And when it comes to Afghanistan and Pakistan, the tribal regions go across both countries. The maps, again, they were drawn up during like the colonial period. A lot of that was, when the British pulled out and they redrew the maps. And that includes not just Afghanistan and Pakistan, but also parts of India and other countries in that region. The tribal territories represent something different. And so when they talk about training between these two countries, a lot of it, again, ties to the terror groups that have worked their way into some of these tribes, which then operate across national borders. And so this is important. But they said this, quote, "The ultimate objective of Jamaat or ICS is to establish a Taliban-type government in Bangladesh. And the ISI has been assuring them of their support in achieving this goal." Again, ISI being allegedly Pakistan intelligence. And again, this is according to an Indian intelligence officer, unnamed in this report. But this is what India is saying right now. Briefly on this, understand the broader implications of this, because India and a lot of these surrounding countries have had long-standing conflicts. For example, India has even, invaded Sri Lanka previously and has had, terror battles to an extent against Pakistan. And so it's a very touchy region given these conflicts, but, them monitoring each other, making these claims, it's still significant. And notice that Hasina tried balancing her relations with China and India, right? This is the leader that was just ousted in Bangladesh. She tried kind of having a middle stance, right? But it says her neutral stance did not please Beijing. The CCP didn't like that. And this is going to be important. Let me explain. First, they say, quote, "Interestingly, many leading figures of the Islamic student outfit managed to charm the Western-affiliated NGOs by using jargon of democracy and rights," as you've seen a lot of Western media reporting. And they say that's framed, this is again part of a strategic planning document, they say, in what it claims. Further, it states the involvement of Beijing, the Chinese Communist Party, became more apparent as China viewed a Pakistani-inclined government in Dhaka as more favorable. Because again, the CCP has deep control within Pakistan. They're doing, for example, in Balochistan, different infrastructure projects the CCP is running, and the CCP is even trying to make the Pakistan government fight some of the terror groups, which are, again, separatist movements within Balochistan. They claim it's their own country. They're even attacking a lot of the Chinese infrastructure. And so the CCP has been working very closely with Pakistan, working against these kinds of networks, and of course, supporting their own in many areas we've seen as well. But they say this, quote, "The support from China's Ministry of State and Security is also suspected to have extended a helping hand as Beijing, the Chinese Communist Party, had been wary of Hasina's balancing act in its dealings with India and China. A government in Dhaka, over which Pakistan has a leverage, will surely better serve Beijing's interests." This is again according to an intelligence source, they claim, according to Indian media. Further, they state that, moreover, the visual evidence of ICS members training in Afghanistan and Pakistan has reinforced the connection between the ICS, ISI, and other terror groups. Again, connections between, they claim, again, this is just an allegation, Pakistan intelligence and these terror organizations, including notably the one that allegedly is tied to the student movement. They note that intelligence reports underscore the meticulous and long-term planning by the ICS to incite violence and destabilize Hasina's government. Now, all this is taking place right as the CCP is holding talks with India about withdrawing their troops from the disputed border regions. And the relationships within the region and India and the CCP's involvement is important. I'll be talking more about this after we come back from a quick break.
Experts agree. One of the best ways to protect against financial uncertainty is to diversify your portfolio. Learn how physical gold and silver can secure your retirement funds from today's economic challenges. With a gold IRA from American Hartford Gold, you can safeguard your wealth with no penalties or taxes when you transfer your current qualifying retirement accounts. Call now and our precious metals specialists will send you a free information kit, no cost or obligation. American Hartford Gold, a trusted industry leader with an A+ from the Better Business Bureau, has a 5-star rating from thousands of happy clients. Whether you are getting physical precious metals in a gold IRA or delivered to your doorstep, we offer only the highest quality gold and silver. For your peace of mind, we also offer a no-fee buyback commitment. a low price guarantee, along with free shipping and free insurance. So don't wait. Call the number on your screen today and secure your financial future.
Welcome back. Bangladesh is currently going through a regime change. And right now there are allegations, at least in India, again just allegations, that the change in power is being orchestrated by the Chinese Communist Party. Local media are reporting that Indian intelligence officials claim the CCP and Pakistan are behind the protests, and that the goal, they say, is to install a new regime in Bangladesh that is friendly to China, which notably they just did. Now look, this would be through the leveraging of China's debt in the country, but one really important point to all this is how it all ties to the CCP's goal, notably within the Eurasian region. Now, what's happening in Bangladesh is taking place right as the CCP is holding talks with India about withdrawing their troops from their disputed border region. Now look, India kind of represents a unique type of threat to the Chinese Communist Party. This is important. Yes, right now, the CCP on the surface is trying to cool ties. Both countries say they're trying to rapidly withdraw their troops from the border region because just recently, you might remember, they were having, small-scale battles, not with guns, but with like swords and rocks and so on. There have been cases, for example, where troops on both sides have been getting killed in these conflicts. And India, of course, is even talking now about building power stations in that region, which building infrastructure would more solidify its control. The CCP very, very much hates this because just like they have border disputes in other regions, South China Sea, East China Sea, and other places, India and that whole region is also, for them at least, one of the regions that could be an invasion route where a war to take place. And because the CCP, in terms of ground and in terms of geography, that is one of its more vulnerable areas. The CCP would not be able to fight a two-front war, not easily at least. Were it to, for example, fight against India and fight against Japan and the US and Australia and other countries between these two sides. Not only because of, the problem they have of unguarded regions, but also just because of basic logistics. That being said, too, India is being seen as a kind of a threat to the CCP in other regards. And when we talk about the rising powers in the world, the rising superpowers, right? They say China, at least used to be a rising superpower, but they say India is too. And India, in long-term growth, actually has population growth. The CCP does not. China has an aging population. India, they tend to have more kids because they don't have like the one-child policy. They're not on that same track. And so India, in terms of long-term growth and cheap manufacturing and even the high-tech industry, is more of a real threat to the CCP's ambitions than a lot of other countries. And also, as well, it's a manufacturing hub. And a lot of companies right now pulling out of China, they're going to surrounding countries. They're going to, for example, to Vietnam, they're going to the Philippines, they're going to India. And India has become one of the main choices because they just have, again, a huge population, relatively cheap manufacturing, and a lot of, able people willing to work. India, to an extent, is also somewhat of a middle ground between the forming global alliances, and this is where it gets complicated. India is part of the Quad Alliance with the United States, Japan, and Australia. The Quad Alliance was formed mainly in opposition to the Chinese Communist Party. But India, they've kind of taken a softer role in that than the other members. For example, you have Japan right now doing military drills with, for example, the Philippines. You have them working with Taiwan to an extent, the Philippines notably. And given that, if a war were to take place now, even though, for example, the Philippines might not be part of the Quad Alliance, Japan's alliance with them could extend that defensive pact to other countries in that region. And so for the CCP, they view this as them being surrounded, right? When it comes to their other border, India is really the only country that's not part of the CCP system, at least how they view it. They're the only country that really maintains a kind of sharper relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. And again, we can see this in the disputed border regions. But at the same time, given this, India is also part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That's a relationship notably that it still has tensions with the CCP with, but that tends to work because India has historically close ties with Russia. And the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is kind of the CCP's alternate world order, right? It's in this context that the Chinese Communist Party has historically looked to pressure India, notably by leveraging its influence with surrounding countries. Russia being the one they used to, notably after the recent meetings of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Putin met, for example, with Modi in India. And after that, only then did India begin making deals within that organization. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is also part of the CCP's agenda of this kind of Eurasian trade route, going across, right, with these different Belt and Road initiatives to establish trade routes in the old Silk Road and these types of things. And so India plays a very crucial role within that, but they're not fully on board with the CCP. They're kind of, again, playing both sides, friendly to the US, friendly notably to other countries in the Quad Alliance, but also relatively peaceful as well when it comes to Russia and slightly antagonistic when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party. And so they're a very big target, notably for the CCP, because of this. And so what has the CCP done? Well, rather than try to just pressure India directly, they use their influence in surrounding countries to do it. For example, there have been a lot of defense reports and so on in the US and other countries that have noted the Chinese Communist Party tends to leverage its influence, notably in Pakistan and in Sri Lanka, to pressure India indirectly. And some of that comes through terror threats. Now, we can look, for example, back at the 2008 Mumbai attacks that were launched from Pakistan. There were allegations of involvement with different government entities. That terror attack, where you had terror groups riding on fast boats and just run around the streets with guns shooting people, they called it like a shoot and scoot type attack. They killed 175 people and injured 300 in India. Now, the Chinese Communist Party has also built deep ties with governments of all of India's neighbors. They have deep ties with Afghanistan, for example. Again, because you might remember, the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan. There was a government that the U.S. spent a very long time building in Afghanistan that was overthrown within a few days by the Taliban. The Taliban took over, they met with the CCP right before that, and they began immediately establishing deals with the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP also has deep ties in Bhutan, Myanmar, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, right? And pretty much, in other words, every country around India. Not to mention the CCP has leveraged national debt in these countries. It's one of its main tools. It uses debt traps from its Belt and Road Initiative to gain control over infrastructure and then begin influencing the politics. This is how the CCP has largely gained control of many countries in that region. Now you can take this story from last year, for example. It was noted that border talks between Bhutan and the CCP were aimed at the CCP's objectives against India. And this is known in the West, again. Even going back a couple years, back in 2022, India was trying to get Sri Lanka out from under the CCP's influence. CNBC said at the time that India tries to prise Sri Lanka loose from China's embrace. India is trying to reassert its traditional influence in South Asia, wary of Chinese attempts to control strategic ports in Sri Lanka. And so again, in terms of Indian intelligence, in terms of the Indian government, they tend to recognize how the CCP leverages debt traps, how the CCP leverages infrastructure projects, how the CCP gets its hooks into these surrounding countries and then uses them as tools to try to influence India. And again, this is just emphasizing, of course, what the significance is of how India views the CCP's attempts to influence and leverage all these surrounding countries. And there were actually many other examples like this. I could go on all day with examples, in fact. Look, notably last year, after that incident in Sri Lanka, the Chinese Communist Party issued a statement with the new government in Sri Lanka, and they stated, quote, Sri Lanka reiterated that it will never allow any separatist activity against China on Sri Lanka's soil. What an interesting joint statement to be made. And keep in mind now the context of that, which is India was trying to intervene in what was taking place in Sri Lanka to make sure the CCP did not gain control. That was in context, again, of a kind of power struggle between the Chinese Communist Party and India over Sri Lanka. And notably as well, historically, India has even militarily occupied parts of Sri Lanka in the past to try to prevent it from falling to China. Now look, of course you have regime changes, right? The fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban, 2021, the ouster of Pakistan's prime minister in 2022, the protests in Sri Lanka, which saw the ouster of its president also in 2022, and now there's the civil war in Myanmar, which the CCP also has ties with, by the way, and also now a regime change in Bangladesh, which the CCP is allegedly interfering with. And take that into account of the CCP's involvement with all of these. Like, although the CCP has gained influence in Bangladesh, also because it got pulled into the CCP's debt traps as well, the government there, at least until now, was seen as being pretty favorable to India. Again, in Bangladesh, they were one of the few countries that wasn't fully, more heavily pulled in by the CCP within that region. And that's why this is so significant on the Indian side. Even last year, Chinese media were noting something important. The Chinese Communist Party has clear financial interests in Bangladesh, and the CCP tends to leverage this type of debt that they have as a form of influence over countries in that region. The CCP right now, they're issuing statements with the tone of a loan shark, out to break some ankles, or in this case, maybe stir up some unrest to get what it wants. I'll be talking more about how the CCP uses debt traps and how that will impact the Asian region. We'll talk about that only on EpochTV.com, the uncensored streaming platform of the Epoch Times. So if you're watching on YouTube, Facebook, X, Rumble, there's a link in the description below. Click on that, get access to the rest of this episode, and also our whole library of shows and our hard-hitting documentaries on issues that really matter, like the Chinese Communist Party's 100-year plan to defeat the United States. The CCP is one of the biggest threats to America. They're using things like propaganda, video games, entertainment, movies, culture to subvert and influence the next generation. This unrestricted war against our country is one of the scariest but least understood issues of our time. Because, it's not tangible. It's being done through soft power and ideological subversion. I've spent over a decade investigating the CCP's subversion, and frankly, it's such an important issue that I made a documentary called The Final War, which exposes this 100-year plot of the CCP to take down America. If you'd like to find out more about what exactly the CCP is plotting against this country, watch The Final War. You can find the link in the description below, and I'll show you all the trailer before we go exclusively to EpochTV.com for the rest of this episode. I'll see you all there.
The greatest threat facing the United States is the CCP.
The Epoch Times investigation team had studied the CCP for years, but what we uncovered was yielding evidence beyond our imagination.
With Chairman Mao, with the Prime Minister, our talks have been characterized by frankness.
The Clinton administration said, "Oh, don't worry about it. This will be a poison pill for China."
China's strategic goal is to make sure that the U.S. has 4 enemies, and one of them must be a terrorist group.
We are giving of our life's blood so that the Chinese Communist Party can survive and thrive.